1. Magalie Bamu. Magalie Bamu, 28 at the time of her trial, and in her late 20s, when arrested in the winter of 2010, had built a modest life in East London after a childhood that moved between the Democratic Republic of the Congo, France, and the United Kingdom. She told the court she'd worked first as a receptionist and later as a dental nurse. Family described her as a sister who, until this tragedy, blended a quiet public image with everyday responsibilities. Her brother Christy and 4 other siblings traveled from Paris to spend Christmas with her, a visit that began as a family holiday and ended in catastrophe. What unfolded inside that flat did not erupt from nowhere. Testimony painted a tense household dominated by her partner, Eric Bikubi, whom she described as controlling and emotionally abusive. The court also heard that Bikubi held a consuming fixation on sorcery known in Lingala as kindoki, framing ordinary conflicts through the lens of supposed spiritual threats. Whether Bamu believed those claims became a central dispute at trial, but the atmosphere of fear, coercion, and escalating suspicion is undisputed. In the days leading up to Christmas Day of 2010, accusations that Christy and 2 of his sisters were involved in witchcraft spiraled into prolonged assaults. The siblings had come from Paris to Newham in East London. By the time emergency services were called, Christy had been forced into a bath and drowned. The ordeal stretched over several days and involved an attempt framed by the couple as a cleansing to force a confession and remove an imagined evil. There were no strangers here. The victim was Magalie's younger brother. The apartment was the couple's home. The case horrified London and reverberated internationally because it unfolded not in secrecy but within a family gathering on Christmas. Police and paramedics arrived to a scene that pointed clearly to days of escalating violence. At the Old Bailey, a jury found both defendants guilty of murder on the first day of March 2012. 4 days later, the judge imposed life sentences, a minimum term of 30 years for Bikubi and 25 years for Bamu. In remarks from the bench, the court rejected Bamu's claim that she did not share any belief in witchcraft and emphasized the cruelty and duration of the abuse. The sentencing prompted renewed warnings from child protection groups and police that abuse linked to faith or belief can be a hidden crime too often unreported until it is too late. As investigators and experts try to understand why motivations were traced to a toxic mix of controlling dynamics at home and a delusional framework supplied by kindoki beliefs, profiles presented in court described Bikubi's profound and disturbing preoccupation with battling supposed spiritual forces, a fixation that set the tone in the flat. The judge found that Bamu's actions striking her brother and encouraging the abuse could not be excused by any claimed disbelief or by her partner's influence. In the end, the case became a stark study of how fear, coercion, and misguided belief can converge, turning a family holiday into a crime scene. Magalie Bamu is serving a life sentence with a minimum term of 25 years. 2. Allison Fluke-Ekren. Allison Fluke-Ekren was in her early 40s when federal agents brought her back to Virginia to face terrorism charges. A former Kansas teacher and mother, she had once presented a picture of ordinary Midwestern life before leaving the United States in the late 2000s and moving through Egypt and Libya, eventually settling in areas of Syria controlled by the Islamic State. People who met her there would later tell investigators that the woman they knew as Muhammad was ambitious, fluent in Arabic, and increasingly committed to the group's ideology. Witness accounts and court filings describe a gradual hardening that became visible in her daily choices, translating speeches for Islamic State leaders, teaching the group's doctrine to other women, and offering lodging to fighters and their families. Prosecutors said she embraced the status and purpose that came with life under the caliphate, and friends noticed she grew more zealous as the war intensified. One witness told agents her radicalization was off the charts, a phrase the government repeated to the judge. In Syria, Fluke-Ekren rose to lead Katiba Nusayba, an all-women's battalion based in Raqqa. There, according to her own plea agreement, and the Justice Department, she organized training in small arms, hand grenades, basic tactics, and the preparation of so-called go bags. Girls and women, some very young, were drilled to defend Islamic State territory as the fight for Raqqa tightened. Multiple witnesses also said she instructed children and tried to motivate her trainees by casting them as the future lifeline of the group's cause. Prosecutors further alleged that her plans were not confined to the battlefield overseas. The government said she discussed potential attacks inside the United States, including the idea of a vehicle packed with explosives in a shopping area or an operation on a college campus, and that she dismissed any plot that failed to cause mass casualties as a waste of resources. While those plans were not carried out, they became a central part of the case, illustrating intent and leadership rather than mere association. Her path to arrest began when Syrian forces took her into custody and turned her over to American authorities. Agents flew her to the Eastern District of Virginia in late January of 2022, where she made her first appearance in federal court. That summer, she pleaded guilty to conspiring to provide material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization, admitting that she had organized and led the Nusayba unit. At sentencing in early November of 2022, prosecutors called her the Empress of the Islamic State's women's wing and urged a severe penalty. In a hearing that drew national coverage, members of her own family asked the judge to impose the maximum allowed. The court ordered a term of 20 years in federal prison, noting the breadth of her conduct and the influence she wielded over others. The Justice Department later summarized that more than 100 women and girls received training under her direction in Raqqa. Experts who study violent extremism have pointed to her case as an example of how women can play organizing, instructional, and enforcement roles within terrorist movements, often leveraging social networks and domestic spaces to extend a group's reach. Prosecutors did not present a medical diagnosis. Instead, their portrait emphasized ideology, opportunity, and a clear pursuit of status within the Islamic State's hierarchy. Allison Fluke-Ekren is serving a 20-year federal sentence following her guilty plea in the Eastern District of Virginia. 3. Deanna Laney. Deanna Laney was 38 years old when her case shocked East Texas. A homemaker in the small community of New Chapel Hill, she was known at church for singing in the choir and in the neighborhood for homeschooling her children. Friends and fellow congregants described a quiet, devout family life centered on worship and routine. That public picture would later collide with testimony about intense religious preoccupations and an unraveling mind no one around her fully grasped. In the months and days leading up to the tragedy, witnesses and court records point to a pattern of apocalyptic thinking and what experts call a deific decree delusion, the fixed belief that God has issued personal commands. Laney reportedly spoke of getting her house in order, watched for signs and omens, and framed ordinary events through spiritual battle. Scholars who later analyzed the case noted that her symptoms fit severe psychosis rather than a sudden impulse or simple fanaticism. On Mother's Day weekend in May of 2003, inside and just outside the family's home in New Chapel Hill, Laney killed her 2 older sons and gravely injured her toddler. She later told investigators she believed she was following divine orders. The exact sequence and implements were established in court, but the lasting impact is the profound breach of trust within a family and congregation that had once embraced her. The youngest child survived with serious injuries. The community response was a mixture of prayer, disbelief, and grief. Laney herself called 911 and spoke with authorities statements that prosecutors and defense attorneys would both rely on to show her state of mind. 5 mental health experts, 2 for the state, 2 for the defense, and 1 appointed by the court, evaluated her and agreed she was experiencing psychotic delusions that left her unable to distinguish right from wrong at the time. In early April of 2004, after hours of deliberation, a Smith County jury returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Following the verdict, the court committed Laney to Kerrville State Hospital. For years, judges reviewed her status at regular intervals, weighing doctors' assessments alongside community safety. In late May of 2012, after a closed hearing where multiple psychiatrists testified, a judge ordered her conditional release. The court's order required strict compliance, medication management, periodic testing, home visits by caseworkers, and a ban on unsupervised contact with minors alongside restrictions on where she could live. Local officials emphasized that the decision followed Texas law once doctors concluded she no longer met the standard for continued inpatient confinement. Psychologically, experts have situated Laney's case within religiously themed psychosis, where delusions co-opt a person's faith and reshape moral judgment. Rather than a calculated plan or rage, evaluators concluded her actions were driven by a fixed belief that a higher power demanded them, a hallmark of severe mental disease under the Texas standard. Legal scholars have contrasted her case with other Texas filicides to explain how unanimous expert findings and clear evidence of moral incapacity can lead juries to an insanity verdict, even in the most devastating circumstances. Deanna Laney was found not guilty by reason of insanity and later conditionally released under court supervision with medication and contact restrictions. 4. Colleen Renee LaRose, was 46 at the time of her arrest, a Pennsylvania woman who had drifted through low-wage work and by the late 2000s was living in a small duplex near Philadelphia. Those who later investigated her life described a history of instability and hardship. She left school early, married young, and spent long stretches caring for family in a modest, often isolated routine. Online, though, she crafted a different identity and a new purpose, one that would carry her far from home and into the sights of federal agents. Her path toward extremism did not ignite overnight. Years of trauma and searching for belonging left her vulnerable to powerful narratives she encountered on the internet. According to a detailed Reuters reconstruction and court filings, she converted to Islam, adopted new usernames, and found validation in forums where overseas contacts framed violence as devotion. The language of mission and sacrifice filled the vacuum of meaning. Academics who later studied her case pointed to a pattern of self-radicalization online, an imagined community that rewarded zeal and promised status to someone who felt invisible in everyday life. In the spring of 2009, a contact she knew only by a code name urged her to travel to Europe and target Swedish artist Lars Vilks, whose drawings had become a flashpoint. That summer, LaRose left for Europe and moved among contacts in Western Europe and Ireland, while messaging co-conspirators about her willingness to act. Prosecutors would later say she also tried to recruit others and discussed identity documents to facilitate travel, the mechanics of a plot that remained aspirational but deeply serious in its intent. She eventually returned to the United States as the plan faltered. The investigation had already begun. Agents had interviewed her in midsummer, and by mid-October of 2009, they arrested her in Philadelphia and kept the case sealed while related arrests unfolded abroad. In early February of 2011, she pleaded guilty in federal court to conspiring to provide material support to terrorists conspiring to kill in a foreign country, making false statements, and attempted identity theft. In admitting her role, she acknowledged discussing the killing of Vilks and recruiting for violence. Over time, she cooperated with agents' assistance that prosecutors later described as very significant, even as they argued she still posed a risk. Sentencing took place in early January of 2014. A federal judge in Philadelphia imposed a 10-year prison term and a period of supervised release, crediting her cooperation, but emphasizing the gravity of a conspiracy centered on murder. In court, LaRose expressed remorse, and coverage noted that the penalty was lower than what prosecutors first sought because of her assistance. In connected cases, a Colorado co-defendant received an 8-year term, and a Maryland teenager who helped the network was sentenced to 5 years, underscoring that investigators viewed the scheme as a broader, internet-driven effort. Why she did it has been debated by scholars and agents alike. The government's portrait emphasized ideology and the pursuit of purpose and recognition inside a transnational movement. Researchers examining her digital trail saw the dynamics of what they call jihad cool or jihad chic, where online space transform grievance into identity and offer community mentorship and imagined heroism, especially potent for someone who felt powerless offline. In this view, LaRose's trajectory was less about a sudden break than about a slow, persuasive reframing of values by an audience that applauded each step toward extremism. Colleen LaRose pleaded guilty in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania and received a 10-year federal sentence, followed by supervised release for her role in the conspiracy to murder Lars Vilks and to provide material support to terrorists. 5. Wanda Eileen Barzee. Wanda Eileen Barzee, about 56 years old when Elizabeth Smart was taken, lived on the margins of Salt Lake City life as the wife and partner of itinerant street preacher Brian David Mitchell. Neighbors and church acquaintances remembered a woman who wrapped daily routines in religious language following Mitchell's claims of prophetic authority. In private, that devotion hardened into obedience, and Barzee's public image as deeply pious would collide with a role that enabled control and isolation. In the years before the crime, Barzee's mental health became a central theme. Judges later found her incompetent to stand trial for long stretches, and a Utah court approved involuntary antipsychotic medication to restore her competency. Reporters and court records describe delusional religiosity and a pattern of submission to Mitchell's self-appointed revelations factors experts say can narrow judgment until ordinary boundaries feel suspended by supposed higher commands. In early June of 2002, Elizabeth Smart was abducted from her family home and taken to a makeshift camp in the foothills above the city where Barzee waited. Within hours, Barzee washed the teenager's feet, dressed her in a robe, and watched as Mitchell staged a so-called spiritual wedding, inaugurating months of captivity, governed by his pseudo-religious rules and enforced by both adults. Later, the trio traveled through parts of California and appeared in public veiled and disguised. The ordeal ended the following March when concerned citizens recognized Smart on a suburban street and called authorities. Detectives arrested Mitchell and Barzee the same day. What followed for Barzee was a long legal detour through mental health evaluations and hospital treatment before she entered a federal guilty plea in mid-November of 2009 to kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor. In May of 2010, a federal judge imposed a 15-year term. That afternoon, a state court added a sentence of 1 to 15 years in a related attempted kidnapping case. Family members delivered searing statements at sentencing, and Barzee later testified against Mitchell during his federal trial. By late September of 2018, after time-served credits were applied across federal and state cases, Barzee walked out of the Utah State Prison. Federal documents show she remained under strict supervised release conditions, including no contact with the Smart family, mental health treatment, and ongoing sex offender requirements. Elizabeth Smart publicly voiced shock and disappointment at the decision to free Barzee while vowing to continue with her life and advocacy. The portrait that emerges from court testimony and psychiatric proceedings is not of a mastermind, but of a woman whose belief in Mitchell's revelations and her own disordered thinking helped sustain his control. Judges and clinicians documented psychosis and religious delusions. At the same time, prosecutors emphasized her active participation in enforcing rules, guarding, and normalizing a fabricated spiritual structure that kept a teenager compliant and out of sight. That combination of illness, obedience, and complicity is why her case has been used in discussions about how coercive faith claims can intersect with severe mental disease to erode moral judgment. In early May of 2025, local news reported that Barzee was arrested again for allegedly violating sex offender restrictions by entering public parks, a development that returned her to court supervision headlines years after her release. Wanda Eileen Barzee pleaded guilty in federal court and received a 15-year sentence with a term of supervised release. She was released in late 2018 and as of early 2025, had been arrested for a supervision violation tied to park restrictions. 6. Sophia Shik. Sophia Shik, born Michelle Ramsden, and in her mid-30s at the time of her arrest, was a mother from West London who had remade herself online as a devoted propagandist for the Islamic State. In court, the judge noted she had a difficult childhood and early adult life, converted to Islam in her mid-20s, and then withdrew from local mosques as her views hardened. By the late 2000-teens, she was running encrypted propaganda channels, one dubbed Greenbirds, crafting messages that praised violence and coached others on how to plan attacks. The portrait that emerged was of a woman whose public world had narrowed, while her digital life became a stage for notoriety and purpose. The triggers were incremental rather than sudden. According to the sentencing record, she had been referred to authorities' prevention programs and struggled with mental health vulnerabilities, but the court found those did not meaningfully reduce her responsibility. When she was stopped from flying to meet a like-minded contact in mainland Europe in late summer of 2019, she told an undercover contact that she now sought revenge in this country. From there, the ideology and the opportunity fused. She spoke of status in death, pledged allegiance, and framed mass killing as a pathway to paradise. Her plan unfolded step by step. In late August of 2019, she reached out on an encrypted app to someone she believed could help her build bombs. He was, in fact, an undercover officer. She traveled into the city of London, stayed overnight at a hotel near the financial district, and the next morning walked through St. Paul's Cathedral to study entrances, security, and where a device might inflict the most harm. She later met a second undercover officer and handed over 2 bags, expecting they would be fitted with explosives. She spoke about placing a bag inside the cathedral, planting a second device at a hotel, and then detonating a vest on public transport. She even moved her timetable from Christmas to Easter to give herself more time to prepare and to train successors to keep her online channels active after she was gone. The operation that trapped her was meticulous. After she failed to attend a follow-up meeting, officers arrested her in mid-October of 2019. In February of the following year at the Old Bailey, she pleaded guilty to preparing acts of terrorism and to disseminating terrorist publications. As sentencing approached, any claim that she had lost her nerve collapsed. Prosecutors disclosed a recorded prison call in which she said she had not developed cold feet and was ready to go through with it, a statement the judge treated as the truth. On a July morning in 2020, the court imposed life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years for the plot, alongside a concurrent term for dissemination. The judge classified her as dangerous, meaning the parole board will decide if and when she can ever be released after that minimum. Experts have since described her case as an example of how online ecosystems can endow extremist identities with meaning, community, and a sense of mission. The judge's remarks highlighted the breadth of her propaganda work, her initiative in selecting targets, and her insistence, caught on tape, that the plan was real. While clinicians acknowledged vulnerabilities, the court concluded her actions were rooted in ideological commitment and the pursuit of impact and recognition. Sophia Shik is serving a life sentence with a minimum term of 14 years following her guilty pleas in London. 7. Naomi Elkins. Naomi Elkins was 27 years old when detectives in Lakewood, New Jersey, took her into custody, a daycare worker and young mother whose life looked ordinary from the outside. Neighbors knew a family rooted in routine, and court filings later described a woman balancing work at a child care center with the demands of caring for 2 little girls. That calm exterior masked a deepening mental health crisis and a private fixation on religious meaning that would soon overtake everything. Witnesses' records and expert testimony point to months of unraveling before the tragedy. According to a clinical psychologist who evaluated her, Elkins had a history of severe illness after childbirth and slid into psychosis shaped by grand religious ideas, believing at times that she or her husband was chosen and that destroying what she loved might somehow defeat evil. In the language of forensic psychiatry, her thinking narrowed into delusion. In everyday terms, reality lost its edges and judgment went with it. On Tuesday, June 25th of 2024, inside the family's Lakewood home, Elkins drowned her daughters, one a toddler just learning words, the other a preschooler who knew favorite songs and snacks. Investigators later reported that one child also suffered a stab wound and that Elkins herself called for help after the fact. In statements to police, she said she acted for religious purposes. The case drew immediate anguished attention across New Jersey, not only because the victims were so young, but because the alleged motive was framed in sacred language her community could not recognize. Detectives quickly gathered physical evidence and recorded statements while prosecutors filed charges, 2 counts of first-degree murder and related weapons offenses. After months of competency reviews and preparation, the matter went before a superior court judge, not a jury. In early April of 2025, after hearing expert testimony and reviewing Elkins' interviews and writings, the court reached a difficult legal conclusion. She had killed her children, but at the time she was legally insane, unable to understand that what she was doing was wrong. The judge entered a finding of not guilty by reason of insanity and ordered Elkins committed to a secure psychiatric hospital with the length of confinement described as 2 lifetime terms under state law. Both the prosecution and the defense acknowledged the weight of the medical evidence supporting that ruling. The public response mixed grief with unease. For many, the notion that faith language could be co-opted by delusion was as chilling as the act itself. In court, the state highlighted Elkins' own words about spiritual purpose. The defense emphasized consistent clinical findings of psychosis and a documented postpartum spiral. A forensic psychologist testified that her beliefs were fixed and grandiose, not merely doubts or dark thoughts, and that she acted under a deific decree delusion, a misfiring conviction that a higher power required the harm. From a legal standpoint, that distinction mattered. It explained behavior without excusing its consequences, directing the outcome toward treatment and supervision rather than a traditional prison term. As for motivation, experts converged on an intersection of severe mental illness and religiously themed delusion, less revenge than a catastrophic psychotic logic that redirected devotion into destruction. The court's order places Elkins in a locked hospital where doctors will treat her and where judges will periodically review whether she remains a danger to herself or others. Those reviews can last a lifetime. The focus is public safety and clinical stability, not punishment alone. Naomi Elkins was found not guilty by reason of insanity and is committed to a secure psychiatric hospital under ongoing court supervision in New Jersey. 8. Tashfeen Malik. Tashfeen Malik was 29 years old when she stepped into American headlines as half of a married pair whose lives had drifted far from ordinary. Born in Pakistan and described by relatives as studious, she spent formative years in Saudi Arabia before returning to Multan to study pharmacy at Bahauddin Zakaria University. Online, she met Syed Rizwan Farouk, a county health inspector in Southern California. After marrying, she entered the United States on a fiancé visa, and the couple soon welcomed a baby daughter. To neighbors, they appeared quiet and private, a family setting that hid a separate, intensifying world of belief and intent. Federal investigators later said the path to violence was gradual. Years before the attack, Malik and Farouk were already exchanging private messages about jihad and martyrdom, evidence of a shared commitment formed well before their engagement. The FBI concluded they were homegrown, violent extremists who drew inspiration from foreign terrorist groups but were not directed by any organization. That distinction shaped the case. The danger grew not from orders delivered abroad, but from ideas they absorbed and affirmed in secret. On the morning of Wednesday, December 2nd, 2015, Farouk attended a work meeting that blended into a holiday gathering at the Inland Regional Center in San Bernardino. He left partway through, returned with Malik, and together they opened fire. A planted explosive failed to detonate, and the pair fled. By the end of the day, 14 people were dead, and more than 20 others were wounded. A police pursuit ended in a shootout that killed both attackers. In the hours around the assault, Malik used an online account to pledge allegiance to the Islamic State, a declaration that underscored ideology rather than any direct command. What followed was a sprawling investigation that reached from a Redlands apartment to digital traces scattered across devices and deleted profiles. Agents recovered a cache of weapons and components, piecing together months of practice and planning. The government also charged Enrique Marquez Jr., a one-time friend of Farouk, for straw purchasing the rifles years earlier and for unrelated plot discussions. He later received a federal sentence. Alongside those criminal proceedings, public debates erupted over visa vetting and the limits of social media screening, especially after journalists and officials corrected early mistaken claims that the couple had posted public messages about jihad. The factual record settled on this. Malik's allegiance statement existed, and their radicalization predated their marriage, but their online praise was conveyed privately. In trying to explain why analysts emphasized ideology and identity over personal grievance, reporting from Pakistan suggested a conservatizing turn during Malik's university years and exposure to stricter teachings, while American counterterrorism officials described the couple consuming what one leader called poison on the internet. The portrait is of a woman who found purpose in an absolutist narrative that sanctified mass casualty plans, encouraged secrecy, and promised honor in death. No public diagnosis of mental illness emerged. Instead, experts pointed to self-radicalization, a partnership that reinforced extreme beliefs and a careful and methodical approach to planning. Tashfeen Malik died after a gun battle with law enforcement on December 2nd, 2015, the same day as the San Bernardino attack that killed 14 people and injured 21 others. 9. Lori Daybell. Lori Vallow Daybell was 46 years old at the time of her arrest in Hawaii, a one-time Texas hairstylist and Arizona mother whose public image blended suburban normalcy with church activity and close-knit family routines. Friends had once seen an energetic woman who loved the spotlight. She even appeared on a television game show years earlier, but by the late 2010s, relatives and neighbors would describe a person increasingly absorbed by fringe religious ideas and a charismatic end times author named Chad Daybell. Those ideas did not arrive all at once. Investigators later outlined a progression private talk of chosen missions, past life identities, and a dark versus light ranking of souls. In messages and testimony, jurors heard that Lori and Chad used the word zombies for people they believed were overtaken by evil spirits, a label that would chillingly be applied to Lori's own children. Prosecutors in both cases argued the apocalyptic framework intertwined with worldly motives like access to insurance and benefits fusing belief opportunity and money. In September of 2019, 16-year-old Tylee Ryan and 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow vanished from Rexburg, Idaho. A welfare check requested by the children's grandparents in late November triggered an urgent search. When officers first knocked, Lori and Chad deflected. By the next day, they had left town. Within weeks, the couple surfaced in Hawaii while declining to produce the children as ordered by an Idaho court. Lori was arrested on the island of Kauai in late February of 2020 and extradited to Idaho. What followed was painstaking police work. Investigators mapped digital trails, including location data from the phone of Lori's brother, Alex Cox, and secured warrants to search Chad Daybell's rural property near Rexburg. In June of 2020, officers recovered the children's remains there, a discovery that shifted the case from missing person mystery to homicide prosecution. Community grief and outrage swelled as vigils were held, and family members spoke publicly about the months of fear and uncertainty. At trial in Boise, jurors heard about a secret world built from doomsday podcasts, numerology-like ratings, and claimed revelations that cast loved ones as obstacles to a prophetic destiny. They also saw bank and benefits records and read messages prosecutors said tied the couple's spiritual language to concrete plans. In mid-May of 2023, an Idaho jury found Lori guilty of the murders of Tylee and JJ and of conspiring to murder Chad's first wife, Tammy Daybell, along with felony theft for taking benefits after the children's deaths. On the last day of July that year, the judge imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Experts and reporters who studied the case have emphasized the psychology of closed communities and shared delusion. Rather than a documented mental disease defense, the courtroom narrative centered on ideology identity and the powerful reinforcement loop of a romantic partnership. Prosecutors described a blend of apocalyptic belief and worldly gain. Friends and former associates testified about language that turned ordinary family tensions into signs of possession, justifying castings and separation. The picture that emerged was of a woman whose spiritual certainty, flattered and amplified by a like-minded partner, overrode parental duty and ordinary moral checks. In the years after Lori's verdict, Chad Daybell faced his own jury. He was convicted in late May of 2024, and days later, an Idaho jury imposed a death sentence. Separate Arizona cases have also moved forward against Lori for conspiracy in the killing of her former husband. Lori Vallow Daybell was convicted in May of 2023 and is serving life in prison without parole for the murders of Tylee Ryan and Joshua J.J. Vallow, and for conspiracy in the death of Tammy Daybell. 10. Roshonara Choudhry. Roshonara Choudhry was 21 years old when she stepped into a community room in Beckton, East London, to meet her Member of Parliament. The daughter of a Bangladeshi family from Newham, she had been a high-achieving student who studied English and communications at King's College London before abruptly leaving her course. Friends and reporting later described a quiet young woman who had become increasingly withdrawn, spending long hours online. In court and profiles that followed a portrait emerged of a diligent student whose private beliefs had shifted sharply in the year before the attack. Investigators and researchers traced that shift to online sermons by the American Yemeni preacher Anwar al-Awlaki. Choudhry told police she had watched many hours of his lectures and believed she had a religious duty to punish those who, in her view, supported the war in Iraq. Academic work on her case describes a relatively brief radicalization arc, months rather than years characterized by solitary consumption of extremist media, a tightening ideological frame, and a growing sense of personal mission. Prosecutors would later emphasize that this motive, not a diagnosable mental illness, drove her decisions. On Friday, May 14th, 2010, Choudhry went to Stephen Tims's constituency surgery at the Beckton Globe Library. She approached him as if to shake his hand and then lunged, using a kitchen knife of roughly 6 inches that she had recently purchased. Officers later recovered a second knife she had brought as a backup. Tim suffered serious abdominal wounds, but survived after rapid medical care. Setting an open local meeting where residents speak to their elected representative made the attack feel both intimate and alarming, and it sent shock waves through Parliament about the security of such events. Choudhry was detained at the scene and quickly made full admissions in interviews, explaining that she targeted Tims because of his votes in favor of the Iraq War. She chose not to attend her Old Bailey trial, instructing her lawyers not to challenge the prosecution because she did not recognize the court's authority. In early November of 2010, a jury found her guilty of attempted murder and of possessing offensive weapons. The next day, the judge imposed life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years, citing her stated desire for martyrdom and the political purpose behind the attack. Contemporary coverage noted her lack of expressed remorse and the court's view that she remained a danger to public officials. Analysts later categorized the case as self-radicalization, reinforced by digital echo chambers, a closed loop of sermons, justifying narratives and a chosen enemy. Choudhry's university departure and her rejection of mainstream authority, religious, academic, and legal, were seen as part of that loop. The prosecution told jurors she was not suffering from mental illness. Rather, she had accepted a worldview that framed violence as duty. For counter-extremism researchers, her path illustrated how an individual without direct command from an organization can move from online persuasion to a real-world attack in a matter of months. Years later, the legal record added a new chapter. In mid-May of 2025, after a hearing that reviewed her behavior and progress in custody, the parole board concluded that imprisonment was no longer necessary for the protection of the public and approved her release on license. Reporting described strict conditions, including a designated address curfew, exclusion zones to prevent contact with the victim, and ongoing supervision terms that allow recall to prison if risk increases. Roshonara Choudhry received a life sentence with a minimum term of 15 years in 2010. In mid-2025, the parole board approved her release on license under strict conditions.